What if the fiercest voices in heavy metal were silenced not by fading fame, but by a virus the world barely understood? These were gods of distortion, kings of chaos, artists who lived loud and fearless. On stage, they looked untouchable. Off stage, some were fighting a battle they couldn't scream away. At a time when AIDS was wrapped in fear, shame, and deadly silence, heavy metal's toughest icons faced something even they couldn't outrun. The headlines didn't tell the full story. The rumors were cruel, and the truth was often buried. This is the raw, heartbreaking story of 30 heavy metal legends whose final fight happened far from the spotlight. 30. Hector Lavoe. When you look at the tragic toll of AIDS on the music world, Hector Lavoe's name stands as a powerful reminder that the epidemic crossed every genre and every border. Though best known as a salsa legend rather than a heavy metal figure, his life reflects how the crisis touched artists everywhere. Rising to fame in the 1970s with his unmistakable voice and emotional delivery, he became one of Latin music's most influential performers. Behind the spotlight, however, his personal life was filled with struggle. Addiction, grief, and health battles slowly took their toll. By the late 1980s, reports confirmed he was living with HIV. At a time when stigma was overwhelming and treatment options were limited, public understanding was still developing. He passed away in 1993 after complications linked to AIDS. His story connects to the broader title because it shows how legendary musicians, whether in rock, metal, or Latin music, were not shielded from the epidemic that reshaped the industry and silenced many voices far too soon. Before moving on, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this powerful list. 29. Vito Russo. Vito Russo may not have been a heavy metal performer, but his impact on the entertainment world during the AIDS crisis was impossible to ignore. As a film historian, author, and activist, he became one of the most visible voices speaking about how the epidemic was affecting artists across music, film, and culture. At a time when fear and misinformation were spreading faster than facts, he pushed for honesty and compassion. He co-founded GLAAD and worked closely with members of the creative community who were quietly suffering. While heavy metal often projected toughness and rebellion, the reality was that the epidemic was touching every corner of the industry. Russo fought to make sure those stories were not erased or ignored. He passed away in 1990 after battling AIDS-related complications. His death marked the loss of a fearless advocate who refused to let silence win. In a list about famous legends lost to AIDS, his name reminds us that the crisis was not just about performers on stage, but also about the voices behind the scenes who shaped culture itself. 28. Essex Hemphill. Essex Hemphill built his reputation through spoken word, poetry, and performance, becoming a strong, creative voice during one of the most painful eras in modern history. While not a heavy metal figure, his work captured the emotional weight of the AIDS epidemic in a way that resonated across artistic communities, including rock and underground music scenes. In the 1980s and early 1990s, he used his art to confront stigma, silence, and fear. At a time when many artists hid their diagnosis, he chose visibility. His performances carried raw honesty, something heavy metal fans often respect and connect with. He spoke about illness, identity, and survival without filters. He died in 1995 from AIDS-related complications. His passing underscored how the epidemic was claiming creative minds from every genre. In the broader story of music history, his life stands as proof that the fight against AIDS was also a fight for dignity and truth within the arts. 27. Wayne Coba. Wayne Coba worked largely outside mainstream fame, yet his presence in underground music circles reflected the quieter side of the epidemic's impact. The heavy metal and alternative scenes of the 1980s thrived on raw energy and rebellion, but behind that intensity were real people facing very real battles. Coba's contributions may not have dominated charts, but within smaller communities, he was respected for his passion and authenticity. During a period when HIV was surrounded by misunderstanding and fear, many musicians struggled to speak openly. Like others in underground scenes, he lived much of his illness away from major media attention. He passed away due to AIDS-related complications, becoming one of the many lesser-known figures affected by the crisis. His story connects to the title because it highlights that the epidemic did not only strike global superstars. It also claimed artists whose names might not headline festivals, but whose influence lived deeply within their local music communities. 26. Gia Karangi. Gia Karangi was primarily known as a groundbreaking fashion model, yet her life was deeply intertwined with the rock and underground music culture of her time. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, she moved within creative circles that overlapped with punk, glam, and metal scenes. Her life unfolded during a time when the AIDS crisis was still poorly understood. Struggles with addiction and personal turmoil placed her at risk, and by the mid-1980s, she was diagnosed with HIV. The stigma surrounding the illness often kept discussions quiet, especially for public figures connected to entertainment. She died in 1986 from AIDS-related complications, becoming one of the first high-profile women publicly associated with the disease. While she was not a heavy metal musician, her passing symbolized how the epidemic reached across industries connected to music culture. Her story stands as a sobering reminder of how fame offered no protection from one of the most devastating health crises of that era. 25. Eazy-E. When talking about famous music figures lost to AIDS, Eazy-E stands out as one of the most shocking and widely publicized cases. Known as a founding member of NWA, he helped reshape hip-hop with a raw, rebellious sound that influenced not just rap, but also rock and metal audiences who connected with that same aggressive energy. In the early 1990s, he was still active in music and business when he suddenly became seriously ill. In 1995, he publicly announced that he had been diagnosed with AIDS. The news stunned fans and fellow artists alike. Just days after revealing his condition, he passed away at the age of 31. His death forced conversations that many in the music industry had avoided. It showed how quickly the disease could move, and how unprepared the public still was. Though not a heavy metal legend, his passing fits into the broader title because it reflects how major figures in powerful, male-dominated music scenes were not immune to the epidemic's reach. 24. Fela Kuti. Fela Kuti was a revolutionary musician whose influence stretched far beyond Afrobeat. His bold political lyrics, long instrumental jams, and fearless stage presence inspired countless artists, including rock and metal performers, drawn to his intensity and resistance spirit. Throughout his life, he challenged authority and refused to stay silent. By the mid-1990s, reports confirmed he was battling AIDS-related illness. His health declined, and he passed away in 1997 at the age of 58. His death was publicly acknowledged as AIDS-related, bringing attention to the epidemic in Africa and beyond. While he was not part of the heavy metal genre, his inclusion in this list shows how the AIDS crisis cut across musical boundaries. Legends from every style were affected. His passing represented not only the loss of a groundbreaking artist, but also a reminder of how the epidemic reshaped global music history. 23. David Oliver. David Oliver built his career as a smooth soul vocalist, signed to Mercury Records. Known for emotional ballads and heartfelt delivery, he found success during the 1970s and early 1980s. Though his style leaned toward soul and R&B, he performed during an era when rock and metal were also dominating the airwaves. As the AIDS crisis unfolded, many artists faced their battles quietly. Oliver's health began declining in the early 1990s. He passed away in 1992 at the age of 50, with reports linking his death to AIDS-related complications. His name may not always appear alongside arena-filling metal acts, but his story still connects to the larger theme. The epidemic was not limited to one genre. It affected musicians across styles, from heavy guitar-driven bands to smooth vocal performers. His passing reminds us that the crisis reshaped the entire music landscape during those painful decades. 22. Alan Murphy. Alan Murphy was a respected session guitarist who worked with major artists, including Kate Bush and Level 42. Though not labeled a heavy metal musician, he operated within the broader rock world, contributing to tours and recordings that reached global audiences. By the late 1980s, he was at the height of his professional success, touring extensively and playing on major albums. Behind the scenes, however, he was battling HIV at a time when treatment options were still limited and stigma remained strong. He died in 1989 at the age of 35 from AIDS-related complications. His passing shocked fellow musicians and highlighted how even respected touring professionals were vulnerable. In a list examining famous music figures lost to AIDS, his story reinforces the reality that the epidemic reached deep into rock culture, affecting not just frontmen but also the talented instrumentalists who shaped the sound behind the scenes. 21. Larry Levan. Larry Levan was not a heavy metal guitarist or frontman, but his influence on music culture was massive. As the resident DJ at Paradise Garage in New York, he helped shape modern club music and influenced producers across rock, pop, and electronic scenes. During the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, his mixes created an atmosphere that felt almost spiritual, pulling crowds into all-night sessions built on rhythm and emotion. While heavy metal thrived in arenas with loud amplifiers and blazing solos, Levan built his own kind of intensity behind turntables. He became a central figure in nightlife culture at a time when the AIDS crisis was beginning to devastate artistic communities. He passed away in 1992 at the age of 38, with reports linking his death to complications related to AIDS. His loss marked another painful chapter in music history. Though from a different genre, his story reflects how the epidemic reshaped the entire industry, cutting down influential figures who defined the sound of an era. 20. Perry Ellis. Perry Ellis was primarily known as a fashion designer, yet his work was closely connected to the music world. During the 1970s and 1980s, his designs influenced stage style for performers across genres, including rock and metal artists who embraced bold, expressive looks. As heavy metal bands crafted their larger-than-life images, designers like Ellis helped shape the visual culture surrounding music. Behind the scenes, however, the AIDS crisis was spreading through creative industries. Ellis became ill during the mid-1980s, and though public details were limited at first, it was later confirmed that he died from AIDS-related complications in 1986. His death highlighted how the epidemic was not confined to performers alone. It affected designers, producers, managers, and countless others tied to the entertainment ecosystem. In the broader story of famous figures lost to AIDS, his passing stands as a reminder that the crisis reshaped not just sound, but also the style and image of an entire generation of artists. 19. Keith Haring. Keith Haring became one of the most recognizable visual artists of the 1980s. His bold, energetic drawings appeared in clubs, galleries, and music venues, often overlapping with punk, new wave, and rock scenes. Heavy metal may have had its own fierce aesthetic, but the underground culture that surrounded it often crossed paths with artists like Haring. He was open about his HIV diagnosis at a time when many public figures stayed silent. Instead of hiding, he used his art to raise awareness and fight stigma. His murals and public works carried messages about love, unity, and the urgent need for compassion during the epidemic. He passed away in 1990 at the age of 31 due to AIDS-related complications. His death was a major cultural loss. While not a musician, his connection to music, culture, and nightlife places him within the wider narrative of creative legends who were claimed by the epidemic that changed the face of entertainment forever. 18. Mark Ashton. Mark Ashton was best known as a political activist and organizer, yet his life intersected strongly with music culture during the 1980s. He founded Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors, a group that famously built bridges between activists and working-class communities during a time of social tension in Britain. His work connected with artists, bands, and performers who supported equality movements. Rock and metal musicians often expressed rebellion through sound, but activists like Ashton fought battles in real life. He became seriously ill in the mid-1980s and died in 1987 from AIDS-related complications at the age of 26. His passing came during the height of fear and misinformation surrounding HIV. Though not a heavy metal performer, his inclusion reflects how the epidemic deeply affected the wider cultural world tied to music scenes. His life represents courage during one of the most difficult periods in modern entertainment history. 17. Danny Pintaro. Danny Pintaro became widely known as a child actor during the 1980s, appearing in popular television shows and quickly becoming a familiar face in American households. While he was not a heavy metal musician, he grew up during the same era when rock and metal dominated youth culture. His story connects to this broader list because it reflects how the AIDS crisis touched many figures in the entertainment world, not just those on concert stages. In later years, Pintaro publicly revealed that he was living with HIV, explaining that he had been diagnosed in the early 2000s. Unlike many artists from the earlier decades who passed away due to limited treatment options, he survived thanks to medical advancements. His openness helped reduce stigma and encouraged conversation around HIV awareness. It is important to clarify that Danny Pintaro did not die from AIDS. He remains alive. His inclusion in earlier lists often reflects confusion between those who lived with HIV and those who died from AIDS-related complications. Accuracy matters deeply when discussing a topic this serious. 16. Cookie Mueller. Cookie Mueller was a writer, actress, and cultural figure deeply rooted in the underground art and music scenes of New York during the 1970s and 1980s. She appeared in independent films and moved within circles that overlapped with punk, experimental rock, and avant-garde performance communities. During the height of the AIDS crisis, many in her creative world were becoming ill. Mueller herself was diagnosed with HIV at a time when public fear and misunderstanding were widespread. Treatment options were limited, and stigma was intense. Despite declining health, she continued writing and expressing herself with honesty and edge. She died in 1989 from AIDS-related complications. Her passing symbolized how deeply the epidemic struck underground art communities that were closely tied to evolving music cultures. Though not a heavy metal legend in the traditional sense, her life reflects how the broader entertainment world suffered devastating losses during that era. 15. Brad Davis. Brad Davis gained international attention for his powerful acting roles in films during the late 1970s and 1980s. Though primarily known for cinema, he operated within entertainment circles closely connected to rock and music culture. Actors, musicians, and performers often shared the same creative spaces, especially during that period. In the late 1980s, Davis was diagnosed with HIV. At that time, public discussion about the illness was still surrounded by fear and misinformation. Reports later confirmed that he died in 1991 at the age of 41, with AIDS-related complications cited as the cause. His passing drew attention to how the epidemic was affecting high-profile figures in Hollywood and beyond. While he was not a heavy metal artist, his story remains part of the broader narrative of famous entertainment figures lost during the crisis. The epidemic reshaped not just music but the entire cultural landscape of that generation. 14. Derek Jarman. Derek Jarman was a filmmaker and visual artist whose work strongly intersected with music culture. He directed music videos and collaborated with influential bands during the 1980s, helping shape the visual identity of alternative and experimental rock scenes. He was one of the first well-known public figures in Britain to openly speak about his HIV diagnosis. Rather than hiding, he used his platform to challenge stigma and advocate for awareness. His openness was rare during a time when many entertainers feared backlash. Jarman passed away in 1994 from AIDS-related complications. His death marked the loss of a fearless, creative voice who blended film, music, and activism. Although he was not a heavy metal performer, his contributions to music, culture, and his visibility during the crisis connect him to the larger story of influential figures claimed by the epidemic that deeply affected the entertainment world. 13. Peter Allen. Peter Allen was a gifted singer, songwriter, and performer, known for his theatrical stage presence and heartfelt compositions. Rising to fame in the 1970s, he built a strong career in both Australia and the United States. While his style leaned more toward pop and adult contemporary, rather than heavy metal, he performed during an era when rock and metal were dominating global stages. Behind the applause and bright lights, Allen faced private health struggles. In the late 1980s, he became seriously ill. At that time, the AIDS crisis was still surrounded by stigma, and many public figures kept their diagnoses out of the spotlight. In 1992, he passed away at the age of 48 from AIDS-related complications. His death reflected the wider reality that the epidemic was cutting through the entire entertainment industry. From arena rock to theatrical pop, no creative space was untouched. His inclusion in this list underscores how deeply the crisis reshaped music history and silenced voices that once filled concert halls around the world. 12. Patrick Cowley. Patrick Cowley became a pioneering force in electronic and disco music during the late 1970s and early 1980s. His innovative production style influenced club culture and later electronic rock movements. While heavy metal followed a different musical path, the creative energy of that era connected multiple genres through shared audiences and nightlife spaces. Cowley was among the earliest high-profile musicians publicly associated with AIDS. As the epidemic began spreading in the early 1980s, very little was understood about the disease. In 1982, he died at the age of 32 from AIDS-related complications, becoming one of the first well-known figures in the music world to be claimed by the illness. His passing marked a turning point in public awareness. It signaled that something serious was unfolding within artistic communities. Though not a heavy metal performer, his influence and early death connect directly to the broader story of famous music legends lost during the devastating early years of the epidemic. 11. Jobriath. Jobriath was one of the earliest openly gay rock musicians to sign a major label deal. In the early 1970s, he emerged with a bold glam rock image that challenged expectations and norms. His theatrical performances and larger-than-life style placed him within the broader rock universe that also gave rise to heavy metal's dramatic aesthetic. Despite early buzz and strong label support, his mainstream success faded, and he later lived a quieter life away from major spotlights. During the 1980s, as the AIDS crisis began devastating artistic communities, he was among those affected. He died in 1983 from AIDS-related complications, making him one of the first rock performers publicly linked to the disease. His death happened at a time when fear and misinformation were at their peak. Including his name in this list highlights how the epidemic struck early and hard within music culture, affecting artists who had once stood boldly on stage with fearless expression. 10. Sylvester. Sylvester was a powerful and flamboyant disco singer whose voice became a defining sound of late 1970s club music. His energetic performances and high-range vocals built a loyal following across dance floors worldwide. Although he was not part of the heavy metal scene, he operated within the same broader entertainment ecosystem that linked rock, disco, and nightlife culture. As the AIDS epidemic intensified during the 1980s, many artists in club and music communities were impacted. Sylvester was diagnosed with HIV and continued performing as long as his health allowed. In 1988, he passed away at the age of 41 from AIDS-related complications. His death was one of the most widely reported in the music world at that time. It forced deeper public conversations about the epidemic and the vulnerability of artists. His inclusion here reflects how the crisis moved beyond genre boundaries, claiming influential voices from every corner of the musical landscape. 9. Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury was one of the most electrifying performers in rock history. As the frontman of Queen, he commanded stadiums with unmatched charisma, powerful vocals, and a fearless stage presence. While Queen blended rock, opera, and pop rather than pure heavy metal, their influence reached metal audiences worldwide. Many metal vocalists later cited his range and theatrical confidence as inspiration. In the late 1980s, rumors about his health began circulating, but he remained private. At a time when HIV carried heavy stigma, silence was common among public figures. On the 24th of November, 1991, Mercury publicly confirmed he had AIDS. Just one day later, he passed away at the age of 45 from AIDS-related complications. His death shocked the world and brought massive global attention to the epidemic. It forced conversations that many industries had avoided. In any list about famous music legends lost to AIDS, his name stands as one of the most impactful losses in modern music history. 8. Arthur Russell. Arthur Russell was a genre-defying musician whose work blended disco, folk, classical, and experimental sounds. Active in New York's underground music scene during the 1970s and 1980s, he collaborated across artistic communities that included rock and alternative performers. Russell was known for pushing boundaries. His music did not fit neatly into one category, much like the era itself. As the AIDS crisis intensified, many artists within his creative circle were affected. Russell himself was diagnosed with HIV and continued working despite declining health. He died in 1992 at the age of 40 from AIDS-related complications. Though he never achieved massive mainstream fame during his lifetime, his influence grew steadily after his death. Including him in this list reflects how the epidemic claimed innovative minds who were reshaping music in quiet but powerful ways, far beyond any single genre label. 7. Michael Callan. Michael Callan was more than a musician. He was also a dedicated activist during one of the most frightening public health crises of the 20th century. As a singer and co-founder of The Flirtations, he used music as a tool for awareness and advocacy. Diagnosed with HIV in the early years of the epidemic, Callan became a vocal supporter of patient rights and compassionate care. At a time when misinformation was everywhere, he worked to educate the public and empower those living with the illness. His openness contrasted sharply with the silence that surrounded many entertainment figures during that era. He passed away in 1993 at the age of 38 due to AIDS-related complications. His story fits this broader title because it highlights not only the loss of creative talent, but also the loss of courageous voices who fought to change how society responded to the epidemic. 6. Klaus Nomi. Klaus Nomi was one of the most visually striking performers of the early 1980s. Blending opera with new wave and experimental pop, he created a futuristic stage persona that stood out in underground music circles. Though not a heavy metal artist, his theatrical style and dramatic presentation influenced alternative and rock communities. As the AIDS crisis emerged, Nomi became one of the earliest high-profile performers publicly associated with the disease. In 1983, he died at the age of 39 from AIDS-related complications. His passing came during a time when little was understood about the illness, and fear dominated public reaction. His death marked a tragic early chapter in the epidemic's impact on the arts. Including him in this list reflects how quickly the crisis began, claiming bold and innovative performers, reshaping the future of music culture in ways few could have predicted. 5. Ray Gillen. Ray Gillen carved out his place in hard rock history with a voice that carried power, grit, and emotion. Best known for his work with Black Sabbath and later with Badlands, he stepped into the spotlight during a competitive era when heavy metal vocals had to be bold and unforgettable. His performances brought intensity that matched the genre's larger-than-life energy. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the AIDS crisis continued spreading through entertainment communities, Gillen was privately battling HIV. At that time, very few rock musicians spoke openly about the illness. Health complications eventually forced changes in his career, and his decline happened largely away from the public eye. He died in 1993 at the age of 34 from AIDS-related complications. His passing remains one of the rare, confirmed cases within the hard rock and metal world. In a list focused on famous music figures lost to AIDS, his name directly connects to heavy metal history and stands as a sobering reminder of vulnerability behind the powerful stage image. 4. Chuck Mosley. Chuck Mosley became known as the original lead singer of Faith No More, helping shape the band's early sound that blended metal, funk, and alternative rock. His raw vocal style contributed to a fusion approach that later influenced multiple heavy music subgenres. Mosley lived with HIV for years, a detail that reflected how the epidemic extended into alternative and metal-adjacent scenes. However, it is important to clarify that he did not die from AIDS. He passed away in 2017 at the age of 57 due to complications related to addiction. Health challenges over the years had included living with HIV, but AIDS was not listed as his cause of death. His inclusion in broader discussions often stems from confusion between HIV diagnosis and AIDS-related mortality. Accuracy matters, especially when dealing with sensitive topics. His story connects to the larger conversation about musicians who lived with HIV during difficult decades in music history. 3. Ricky Wilson. Ricky Wilson was the founding guitarist of the B-52s, bringing a sharp, distinctive sound that helped define the band's early success. Songs like Rock Lobster carried an offbeat energy that stood out during the late 1970s and early 1980s. While not a heavy metal act, the band shared stages and audiences within the broader rock scene. Wilson kept his illness private during a time when public disclosure often led to fear and stigma. In 1985, he died at the age of 32 from complications related to AIDS. His passing was initially kept quiet regarding the exact cause, reflecting the atmosphere of uncertainty that surrounded the disease during its early years. His death was one of the earliest significant losses in the music industry linked to AIDS. Including him in this list highlights how the epidemic began affecting musicians well before widespread public understanding developed. 2. Tom Fogerty. Tom Fogerty, best known as the rhythm guitarist for Creedence Clearwater Revival, helped shape one of the most recognizable rock sounds of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Though CCR was not a heavy metal band, their influence on American rock culture laid the groundwork that later metal artists built upon. Fogerty contracted HIV through a contaminated blood transfusion received during back surgery. His case highlighted another tragic pathway through which the virus spread during the early years of the epidemic, before stronger screening measures were in place. Despite declining health, he continued musical involvement as long as possible. He died in 1990 at the age of 48 from AIDS-related complications. His passing underscored how the epidemic reached beyond lifestyle stereotypes and affected musicians in unexpected ways. His story remains a significant example of how medical limitations during that era contributed to devastating outcomes across the music industry. 1. Robin Crosby. Robin Crosby was the towering guitarist of Rat, one of the defining glam metal bands of the 1980s. With his tall frame, wild stage presence, and heavy riffs, he helped shape the Sunset Strip sound that filled arenas and ruled music television. Songs like Round and Lay It Down became anthems of the era, driven by flashy guitars and a larger-than-life image. On the surface, it looked like pure success. But behind the spotlight, Crosby was fighting battles few fans could see. During the height of his fame, he was diagnosed as HIV positive. At a time when heavy metal projected toughness and excess, vulnerability was rarely discussed. The culture around glam metal often celebrated partying, rebellion, and image, leaving little room for honest conversations about health. As the years passed, his struggles with addiction and illness became harder to hide. The physical decline was painful and public. By the early 1990s, his health had severely deteriorated. In 1994, He died at the age of 33 from AIDS-related complications. His death remains one of the most direct and confirmed links between the heavy metal world and the AIDS epidemic. In a genre built on power and volume, his story reveals a quieter, heartbreaking truth. Even legends who seemed unstoppable were not immune to one of the most devastating health crises of their generation. Their music still shakes speakers, their lyrics still hit hard, and their presence, it still feels alive every time that opening riff kicks in. But behind the power chords and screaming crowds were real people who faced fear, pain, and silence in ways most fans never saw. These stories aren't just about loss. They're about courage, truth, and remembering the artists who gave everything to the stage, even while fighting battles in the dark. So now it's your turn. Which legend story hit you the hardest, and whose music will you play a little louder tonight in their honor? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with a true metal fan, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the shadows of fame.